Hello there, David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms, and this hopefully will be the start of either be one video or a series of videos where I sort of ask a schizo. So one of the kind of traditional parodies about people who are crazy is they talk to themselves, right? But what else am I doing on a video blog if not talking to myself? So these are basically my questions for the self, ask a schizo, where I'm in dialogue with myself, about myself, to myself, for your viewing pleasure. So hopefully you'll enjoy. And I've prepared 3 questions so far, and then I'm going to have a quick review, and then I might do another 3 questions. We'll see how it goes. So the first question that I presented myself with is the following. What part of your experience of reality defines you as being schizophrenic? So I've worded this particularly specifically. So what part of my experiences of reality define me as being schizophrenic? And the main ones are hallucinations, delusions, and then they're what you call positive symptoms. But I'll go into them more personally in a second, but they're the positive symptoms. Then there's also this like an apathy, a dissociative quality, a kind of separation from society in a traditional way, reclusiveness, depression, various qualities like that, which are sort of the negative symptoms. These are the sort of psychological terms for it. You get positive and negative symptoms. But with my experience personally, what defines me as being the most significant symptom I have is my thought broadcasting, because a lot of the other stuff I have, I guess you would count as mystical experiences, and while they can be extremely negatively toned, they're still technically mystical experiences and part of a different framework and understanding of reality that's perhaps atypical, but not necessarily indicative of mental illness in general. So I'm just getting my vape. You've got to have me a vape while I'm doing a video. But the thought broadcasting is in particular one of those qualities and of experience. And thought broadcasting is more or less the experience that people can hear your thoughts and that you can hear their thoughts. But different from hearing voices of people's thoughts, they can hear your thoughts as well. So that's kind of the key attribute. But to me, I interpret that as being part of a grander scheme, like a grander synchronous schema around how reality works. I'll probably go into more detail in that later on, but there's thought broadcasting, there is the accompanying auditory and visual hallucinations, because all my hallucinations tend to be congruent as one central thing. It's not like I'll see a dragon and then hear some laughter and then and feel some burning here, there, the other, whatever. It's like they're all, if I don't see dragons necessarily, I see demons. That's quite disturbing and confusing, but also entertaining to kill the fuck out of them. So yeah, there's things like that, but they're all congruent. Like it's one solid image. It's not like they're random fragmented data. They're like they come as one whole process. But the main one for me is thought broadcasting. Is obviously I see things that other people don't see. I hear things that other people don't hear. I perceive things that other people don't perceive, and I live in a kind of what I consider to be a slightly out of phase with the rest of reality. And whether you take that in a literalistic way of like my brain is out of sync with the rest of society on some literal like actual level, like I see things differently, or whether you take it how I see it, which is more like I'm in basically permanently in an altered state, more or less. Like I can go into a kind of more congruent non-altered state and a more ordinary waking state of consciousness, but I have to take medication to be there, and it doesn't work entirely effectively. Yeah, so that's kind of a brief bit there. But yeah, generally speaking, it's the traditional schizophrenia symptoms, hallucinations, delusions. But then with the delusions, I find them, it would be irrational not to believe the experiences I'm having unless they were completely false and not generated by anything useful. But again, we'll probably explore that more later in the video. Yeah, so I'm going to come back to that, and we'll be back in a second with questions. Okay, so question 2, let's see what I put. Yes. What, if anything, makes you distinct from other people with your diagnosis? So, I probably phrased it this way deliberately for a specific reason, being that not necessarily anything that makes me distinct as from being a schizophrenic, but because I've got a lot of the classical symptoms. But what I've been told repeatedly, and this isn't just by people in a medical perspective, but also people outside that have observed me, that have met other schizophrenics as well. But often this is professed to me by people that I've worked with that have been treating me for my schizophrenia, which is that I have a rather unusual or relatively unique level of insight and ability to be rationally explain or objectively analyse what's happening to me, even though I find it stressful, traumatic and confusing and weird and disorienting. I'm still able to lucidly articulate that outwardly, so I guess that's the thing that makes me a little bit different, because I'm not so completely consumed by delusions, not so completely consumed on a general day-to-day basis, not so completely consumed by my condition that I'm unable to articulate it. Yeah, but then in a lot of ways I'm pretty traditionally schizophrenic. So like if you ever Google the actual definition and the symptoms of schizophrenia, like I tick a lot of those boxes. I sort of experience extreme anxiety. Like, I managed to function now, but it's taken me 12 years to get to the point where I can actually function, even to this level. And as I've said in other videos before, the only reason I'm this candid and lucid is because I'm sat on my own talking to a screen, which, yeah, it's not necessarily how I am if I was out in public discussing these things, or when these things just come up in conversation in general. It's usually disturbing for me. But yeah, that is the quality of me that makes me slightly distinct from especially people in the early stages of the diagnosis, or like with the first episode of like acute psychosis or anything like that. Like for when I submitted myself to hospital, for example, I knew that something was fundamentally wrong with my psyche, and I was able and willing to address that, which is why I sought medical help. So even in the state of utter psychosis and madness and chaos, I was still able to go rationally, like, okay, this is a malfunction somehow, or this is something that I need to address. Even if I was completely absorbed in the crazy experience of it, I was still willing to go and actually get a second opinion about what I was experiencing and try and get some sort of lucidity, and that stayed with me all the way through it, and has been a big part of my recovery, I think, as well. But saying that, like, I think people with schizophrenia get generally a bad rap. They're assumed to just be crazy, or just the worst kind of crazy, other than being like a sociopath or something. And it's simply not true. In my experience, like it's 1 in 10 people is the statistics on it. But in my experience, a lot of people with schizophrenia aren't just unstable, crazy people. A lot of them are reasonable, decent people that similarly to me have made huge leaps and bounds in processing their condition. Yeah, so I'm not that distinct from other people with schizophrenia, but I'm uniquely lucid, apparently. Basically, I'm able to describe what's happening to me through this kind of meditative dissociation. So even when I'm in the midst of a psychosis style experience, I'm still able to generally, unless it's an extreme state, like an extreme state, I'm generally able to articulate and navigate that world rationally without losing touch with the base grounding of reality. So I'm very grounded and able to stabilise. But then I've also gone on flights of delusion and fantasy, so that's not necessarily the case. But at least in the past 5 to 8 years or so, I've become uniquely lucid about the experience and able to articulate it well. So that's that. So question 3 is a continuation of the question 1, which is, tell us more about the thought broadcasting and other schizophrenic features of your experience. And with that question, it's sort of loaded in terms of, so earlier on I mentioned that there may be a synchronistic element to my experience, and that with the thought broadcasting I tend to have the perspective that everything is part of one congruent whole, and especially when I'm psychotic or in an agitated, intense schizophrenic type state, there's very much this sense that there is no coincidence. And not only is there no coincidence, that everything happens for a compelling and lucid and congruent reason. That there are messages within all of those experiences that you can have an active participation with and commit dialogue through them. And I guess this kind of relates to the Jungian idea of synchronicity, like a lucid waking state. So for example, when you wake up from a dream, you can look back and analyze rationally, and some people can do this in the dream state as well, but generally this is more of a Freudian psychoanalysis of dream states. You come out of it and you go, that was triggered by that event, and that meant that, and that meant that, and that meant that, and you can form a congruent narrative through it. This is basically applying that same process to the waking world. And it happened to me autonomously, I guess you would say. Like, it started to happen, and then I started to look into what this was and found mechanisms to describe it and words to be articulate about it. But it's basically like a lucid waking state. You go into such a position where you realize that everything is interconnected. So it's sort of like a kind of terrifying enlightenment state, I guess you would say. The oneness of everything, and everything is, well, it's not always terrifying either. Sometimes it's extremely beautiful, but it's weaving a thread through everything so that every event that happens is steeped in meaning, and it can be micro events, tiny little events that lead on to other things, and you see the grand interconnectedness of all things. And that is what gives me this thought broadcasting, either capability or burden or curse or whatever, or blessing, whatever it is, which is that I can then formulate, because I'm in that synchronous state, I can formulate a question internally, ask that of the universe, and then this synchronicity will then reply to me, and there's a congruent thread through all these different forms of dialogue, which give like a whole picture of the answer, and it becomes a dialogue, and it goes on sometimes for months at a time. And I've learned over time to like just hang up that phone and not always talk to them, but it's always available to me, and actually the less I do it, the less difficult it is to switch it off. But the more you do it, the better and more accurate the information is. So it's a difficult thing to discuss. So that's kind of how the thought broadcasting works for me. Is basically, it's like being psychic, but not only am I communicating with the individual consciousness of each being, but there's a kind of grandiose sort of God layer, I guess you would call it, of the higher communication from me being in a state of connectedness with higher self, whereby I can communicate throughout all of those surrounding me in a big conscious bubble of like, kind of, it's not entirely pleasant for me to talk about this, but yeah, it's sort of like everything is happening for me, to me, by me, with me, and through me, as a reaction to these thoughts, but also that I'm just a facet of that happening the other way around. So that's one of those things. The other important factor of my schizophrenia type experience is the visual hallucinations, which is kind of, it's not, some people, like, I describe it to people so they can relate to it as it's like seeing auras, but it's not like seeing auras. There's generally not that many colour oriented things in my hallucinations. It's more like seeing the focal point of someone's mind, or where they're attended to, or what they're thinking about, manifesting as a kind of gelatinous floating fluffy white light, dark light, shades of different intention and focusedness and rigidity or softness, or an outline of like how present someone is in the moment. They'll be really fixed and tight to their body, or if they're kind of lost in thought, they'll be more floaty and light, or sometimes they'll be back here if they're in danger, or like really excited, or really meditative, or any kind of like flow state. You'll be more like off or like with me, I see myself as being slightly out of phase with my body sometimes, and I have to kind of manually draw myself back in. So that's the end of the visual hallucination side of things. And it's all of that seems to be, to me, a really useful source of information, because I don't have any rational explanation for them. And it's also, the way I've best describe it is, it's like the unconscious or the subconscious, that information that is available to me, I have a kind of framework, a network, an extra sensory network overlaying how I can interact with subconscious data. Things that are normally subconscious then come to me through these hallucinations, and thus I've got a greater degree, not like more control, but a greater degree of awareness of what is in my subconscious field of it, and that information comes to me at a conscious level involuntarily. Thus it's like having an extra sense about that kind of thing. And it's actually pretty cool, but it's also overwhelming and disturbing and weird, but useful. It's very useful. So that's sort of my answer about the thought broadcasting. Got a bit of elements of synchronicity and then also schizophrenia features. So question 4 is another follow-on question from question 2 now, which, can you elaborate more on what you mean about being out of sync with the rest of reality? And yes, I can. It's a bit like what I was saying in the previous part of the video about being out of phase with my body, but it's also like, I don't know, there's this perspective of like, when I'm really in schizophrenia experience, when I'm in the psychotic kind of revelatory state where everything all makes sense and is all part of one greater grandiose whole, there's an enormous pressure from the rest of reality to either leave into there or come back to them, but it's not like there seems to be this resistance to there being a bridge between the different levels of reality, which is kind of what I consider myself to be, a kind of like, I wouldn't necessarily say divine conduit, that's not what I'm thinking of, but definitely like a conduit between the different altered states of consciousness. I find it very easy to drift into altered states of consciousness, and as I said at the very start of the video, I think it's actually the greater difficulty is staying in an ordinary state of consciousness. That might have been another take actually that I mentioned that, but I'm mentioning it now anyway. So yeah, being in sync with the rest of reality, as in line with the idea that, so our general day-to-day waking consciousness state is that we're all individuals, that nothing is meaningful. Coincidences are just coincidences and aren't really worth measuring or being mindful of what those coincidences are. And you get a lot of people report confirmation bias, where you get these kind of like cognitive jumps between stages of like, oh no, that's what a coincidence, this thing happened, and then that's just fine. But if they don't, because they pay no mind to it because it's labelled a coincidence, they don't see the correlating process that evolved behind that. And I feel, yeah, like I'm kind of out of phase with the sort of brainwave state, the kind of state of consciousness that most people are in most of the time, which is a kind of alpha beta wave state, as far as I gather from my little knowledge about frequencies of neuroscience and stuff. Probably bollocks. Anyway, the normal waking state of consciousness tends to be very literalist, that the world is real, it's not a dream state. This is something I'll come back to later on, because I find that really interesting to discuss. The idea that reality is basically a dream, because to me, although it's a recurrent dream, to me reality is a dream fundamentally, whereas everyone else around me, not just in my immediate locale, but like most people that I talk to about this subject, don't generally tend to acknowledge the similarities between the dream state and this reality, and there's a lot of credence given to the idea that this reality is fundamentally real, or the basic grounding for reality, and it's something that I just don't agree with. So I used to, it's very much more so, not so much these days, because I'm more integrated into the returning to the normal everyday waking state of consciousness. But there's this distinct quality of like, I behave as though things were a dream. I obviously understand there's limitations in this dream to what's physically possible, or in terms of physics, or in terms of the rules of this reality. There are defined rules of this reality, but how I interpret that information is entirely different from sort of the average person's waking state of consciousness. Like, I've met people who are on psychedelics who are more than happy to embrace that idea, but they don't retain that state coming out of it, or they don't. Generally, most people don't tend to believe that reality is a dream. So that's sort of the summary of question 4, which will lead on to question 5. So I'm going to just briefly pause, and then I'll be back with question 5. For question 5, what did I put for question 5? You put further continuation. What makes you think that reality is a dream, and how does this affect your behaviour? So the qualities of reality are fundamentally indistinct from a dream, and my basic perspective is that, to my mind anyway, and my basic perspective is that when you're in the dream state, for example, when you're having a dream at night and asleep, you don't necessarily, unless you become lucid or awakened or wake from that dream, you don't question the rules, the syntax, the etymology, the breakdown, the narrative of the dream seems completely rational until you exit that dream, and that it's the function of your memory. So like, I've definitely had lucid dreams and dreams in general where like I've been able to recall an entire lifetime and the whole narrative all made sense in the dream. This is really common for me, actually. The idea that in the dream makes sense, and it's only when you wake up you start to go, that was some crazy shit about some shit that was crazy, and that relates to this thing in my life, and that relates to the other thing, and the other thing, and the other thing, and the other thing. And it's suggested that this is added post the event. This is added once you wake up, you then interpret that way. And all I'm really arguing is that this reality has its own rule system, and because I'm in this brain, in this body, in this physical universe, or this level, this dimension of reality, I believe the memories that I perceive. I believe the state that I'm in to be real because this person I'm embodying now believes that's real. So memory is the thing that gives validity to the existence of reality as being anything grounded or continuous or congruent, or if you see what I mean. And this affects my behaviour to a certain extent, having this belief that reality is a dream, because it changes the nature of how I interpret the information around me. It changes the nature of how I populate my thoughts, or what thoughts occur to me when because I'm not constantly thinking, oh, this is a dream, this is a dream, this is a dream, this is a dream. But when it does occur to me, and when I allow myself to go into that suspension of disbelief and go into that state where I'm not just locked down, like I've trained myself to do, go into this cognitive dissonance state of, okay, I know this is a dream, but actually, I know this is a dream, but actually, I'm not going to believe it's a dream because that makes it non-functional as part of the dream, which is such a paradoxical thing to say. So it affects my behaviour in that I realise that this reality is non-substantial, and thus that I can alter. And it also makes me realise that behaviourally, with the altered states I've experienced in the past, in this reality and in the dream state as well, that it's possible to have entirely different frames of reference, entirely different ways of interpreting reality, and reality itself being different fundamentally, dependent on the part of your brain that's activated, or the altered state that you're in, or the level of relaxation, the level of different neurotransmitters, the level of noradrenaline or norepinephrine or whatever it is that goes through your body that drastically alters your perception of reality fundamentally. And yet still there's this constant congruent thread of consciousness in the middle of that. And it affects my behaviour in that I'm able to I feel much more liberated by that perspective of that it's a dream, because it's not so consequential. I'm not so caught up in the feeling that like I must take this very seriously, because I do take reality seriously. This this waking reality very seriously to a certain extent, but it's not so like, it's not the only thing that exists. Therefore, if it ends, I'm not going to be that devastated by it, but also I value the existence of my life. I try and perpetuate the existence of this being, this organism, this life form. But I protect myself. I react I use my survival instincts to continue to react. But it means that I get a lot more serenity from the fact that I know that this reality only seems real because I remember it being real in the recurrent events that are told by the narrative of my memory and projecting into the future. But actually in the moment, life is a kind of timeless fluxing bubble, and that there is really just, it's just a dream. It's not any more tangible than anything else that I've experienced. And there's multiple levels of reality as well. That's something I wanted to come back to. I've made a few notes down here, but I'll go into that in like a 5B. Just give me a... So 5B, so we're looking at what makes you think this reality is a dream and how does it affect your behaviour. So the reasons that I reached the conclusion that reality is a dream wasn't just experientially just going, oh, maybe this is a dream. It was like, literally had the experience of being in such extreme states in this reality that it made me question the validity of my normal waking state. That's one factor. 2, having lucid dreams where, much like when you wake up from a dream, it seems random and garbled and nonsensical. When I had my sort of fall from grace or pre-enlightenment, post-enlightenment experience of thinking I'd gone to hell and died, that brought me out of a sort of sleep state in this reality where I awoke to this reality for better or worse. And that's like a lucid living state that made the state I was in before I had this awakening, so that would have been around 19 years old, maybe 20, 21 was the peak of it. So that 2-3 year period, when I went through the peak of that, I had this awakening to this reality, and everything that seemed like it happened before the awakening experience seemed like that was just a black and white garbled nonsensical dream, and that was in this reality. It seemed like I'd woken from a dream, and that I couldn't really remember what happened before. It didn't have meaning. It was just nonsense. And it kind of awoke from this kind of state of amnesia. So I've had lucid waking. I've had waking up from a dream to continue in the dream, but in a lucid waking state. And then I've also had, within sleep, had hyper vivid dreams whereby the reality expressed and that I perceived, and the multiple layers of reality and the multiple levels of reality and the multiple experiences of different sort of parallel dimensions and all these kind of crazy things that I've experienced through the lucid dreaming state make this reality seem like it's just insubstantial by comparison to that even further. So you get dreaming, then you've got waking, then you've got lucid waking, and then you go full scope and you go lucid waking, where you go into the altered state such that, yeah, it's a continuing process of awakening basically. And then you get to the zenith of that, which is disembodied consciousness, but in an infinite spectrum of kind of potential outcomes, and then you visit new realities in the lucid dreaming state. That hasn't happened to me in a while, but it also happens more often than I really give it credit for. But I sort of will it away, or willfully choose not to acknowledge that. But it's true. It's fundamentally true. My experience is that there can be multiple levels of awakening within dreams that make you then realise that the dream itself was a dream, and thus can be awoken from, and that adds new validity to the realism and the depth of the reality you're in once you become awake. But also it subtracts validity and realism from the state you were in prior. So that's just a thing that I wanted to discuss. That so it affects my behaviour in that my fundamental perception of reality shifts, and then I don't perpetuate the same behaviour and lifestyle choices and everything else, and other things that I did prior to the new level of awakening seem arbitrary and kind of ridiculous and a bit of a parody. So that's quite cool. So we'll move on to question 6 briefly. So I've put here for question 6, tell us more about the different levels of reality. So we sort of covered it a little bit, which is there's basically 4 realms that the fundamental basics. So if you imagine bang in the middle, So so we've got 5 basic layers then, let's say. So in the middle is this reality, the 3D reality. So you're in this reality, but you're in a normal waking state of consciousness where this seems real and blah 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 blah. And then you might go to sleep and have dreams that seem real in the dream, and you don't really question it until you wake up and you scarcely remember your dreams. So there's that. Then there's the further state of unconsciousness, which is being completely unconscious, which is the sort of deep sleep state, where you can be awoken from it, and then from then you realise that you're in a state of extreme deep thought, but you don't have any recall of that state at all whatsoever. And similar to the dreaming state, where you don't have any recall unless you wake up from the dream. So when you have a complete cycle, you don't recall it. But with the deep sleep state, there's no like REM phenomena, there's no dreams going on there, you're just in like extreme deep thought, as far as I'm aware. So they're the 3 lower levels, and then you can wake up, but you can wake up in any single one of them, which is the ironic thing, but we won't go into that just here. And then you've got being in this reality, where you are awake to the fact that this reality is a dreamscape with a different set of rules, like a shared dream. And that's what like the lucid waking state, or the sort of enlightened or awakened state, if that's how you choose to interpret it. Then there is also the hyper awakened state, of which I haven't actually attained yet, but I postulate that it's there because I've gone into it briefly, but I haven't been able to completely leave this reality spontaneously without it being drug related, basically. But I have been into states where this reality takes on a new form and becomes hyper vivid, like as described earlier, the hyper vivid lucid dreaming state, where you actually transition to other realities within this one. Parallel versions or parallel dimensions of this reality are accessible through altered states, is what I'm arguing, basically. And then through all of them you can wake up and become conscious of what you're doing, and that you're in a kind of field of awareness that could be equated to what we think of traditionally as dreams. Then you've got the lucid dreaming state, so you become awakened in the normal dream state, so you know that the dream's a dream, you know that life is a dream, you know that the lucid experiences of being lucid waking is also a kind of dream reality. But then you have this integrated process where at each level you awaken to a new form of the dream, and they're all interrelated. So that's just those sort of 5 central levels of reality.